Engines roared into a quiet Vermont town, and inside a small diner, grown men mocked, shoved, and laughed until the whole room fell silent. No one dared to stand, except a 15-year-old boy, with nothing but a trembling voice and a sketchbook in his hands. Ethan Ward broke the silence that terrified everyone else. What happened next stunned the entire town. The arrival of men whose silence carried more weight than fists. What would make battle-hardened veterans rise for a boy? And why did they leave him with a gift he would never forget? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The town of Ridgefield lay tucked between the folds of Vermont hills, the kind of place that seemed unchanged by the passing decades. Main Street was short enough that you could walk its length in 10 minutes, and on most afternoons, there was no need to hurry. The sidewalks carried the quiet rhythm of people who knew one another too well to bother with introductions. Children pedaled past on bikes with rusty chains, their laughter chasing the fading autumn light, while old men in flannel jackets leaned against storefronts, exchanging the same stories they had told for years. Ridgefield didn't ask for much. It existed in a steady hum, a life measured in coffee refills and gas pumps, in neighbors who still waved from porches as cars drove by. At the center of this rhythm stood Miller's Diner, a low building of faded red brick with a sign that buzzed faintly when the neon coffee cup flickered to life. Its booths were lined with cracked leather cushions, its counter crowded with mugs that never stayed empty for long. The waitress knew the order of every regular before they sat down, and the clatter of plates in the kitchen was part of the town soundtrack. Across the street, the gas station offered its own kind of gathering place, where teenagers loitered by the vending machine and truck drivers filled their tanks before taking the winding road north. Between these two landmarks stretched the heartbeat of Ridgefield, ordinary people living ordinary days, bound together by routine. The autumn air carried with it a crispness that sharpened the colors of the maples. Red leaves drifted across the cracked sidewalks, catching on the boots of customers stepping into the diner. The bell above the door rang with the same thin note it always had, and inside, the air smelled of coffee strong enough to keep farmers awake through dawn chores. In one corner booth, a pair of mechanics traded talk about the engine they couldn't quite fix. At the counter, the pharmacist from down the street stirred sugar into his tea with the absent-minded patience of a man who had done the same thing every afternoon for 20 years. There was nothing extraordinary in sight, and that was the comfort of Ridgefield, its sameness, its predictability. The gas station across the way told a similar story. Its pump handles were chipped with age, its overhead light buzzing faintly as dusk settled. Teenagers with nothing better to do gathered there after school, swapping stories no one would remember in the morning. Their voices carried across the lot, mingling with the occasional hiss of the air compressor. Behind the counter, the clerk flicked through a newspaper, uninterested in the noise outside, his world confined to the glass walls of the little booth. Cars pulled in, filled up, and left without ceremony, each transaction part of the town's steady beat. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else, or at least believed they did. Secrets were hard to keep in Ridgefield, yet small ones lingered in the corners. Glances exchanged at the diner, debts left unpaid at the gas station, silences carried home at night. The town didn't ask questions too loudly. It let things rest, like the dust that settled on the shelves of the hardware store, unnoticed but always present. People found comfort in the familiarity, even when it came with its own weight. Ridgefield wasn't known beyond its county line. Travelers passing through rarely stayed long enough to remember its name. But for those who called it home, it was more than a collection of buildings. It was a rhythm of boots on the floorboards of Miller's Diner, the hum of engines at the gas station, the way the church bell tolled across the hills on Sunday mornings. It was a town that had seen little change, and for most, that was enough. But beneath the stillness, beneath the comfort routine, there lingered the possibility that even here, in a place where nothing seemed to happen, everything could change in a single afternoon. Ethan Ward was 15, though he carried himself with a seriousness that made him seem older to those who watched him from a distance. He had grown tall quickly, his limbs lanky in a way that comes with sudden growth, but his face still held the roundness of youth. His dark hair often fell into his eyes no matter how many times he brushed it back, and he wore the same faded jacket each day, patched twice at the elbows by his mother's careful hand. What set him apart wasn't how he looked, but how he noticed things. While other boys his age filled the air with noise, Ethan lingered at the edges, listening, studying, watching more than he spoke. His world had been shaped by absence. His father, once a steady figure in their small household, had died when Ethan was only 8. The memories remained blurred. Mornings in the workshop, the smell of wood shavings, the sound of laughter echoing through a kitchen that now felt quieter than it should. His mother, Claire, never spoke much about the loss, but it showed in the lines around her eyes and the way she kept the house running on discipline and quiet strength. She worked double shifts at the grocery store to keep the bills paid. And when she came home late, Ethan was often the one who would cook dinner, checked that the doors were locked, and made sure homework was finished. Responsibility wasn't something he had chosen. It had been handed to him, and he carried it without complaint. Most afternoons, he stopped by Miller's Diner after school, not because he had money to spare, but because it felt less lonely than sitting at home with the ticking of the old wall clock. The waitresses there had known him since childhood and never minded if he stretched a single glass of milk for an hour while he filled his sketchbook with pencil lines. He drew everything: people and booths, cars outside the window, the way light fractured through the glass sugar jars on the counter. His teacher said he had an eye for detail, but Ethan didn't draw for praise. He drew because it gave him something to hold on to, a way to make sense of the world when words didn't seem to fit. He wasn't a troublemaker, though trouble often noticed him. At school, bigger kids sometimes nudged him in the hall, muttered comments about his worn shoes or the silence that hung around him. He rarely reacted. His mother had taught him early that dignity was not in answering every insult, but in choosing which ones deserve his time. Still, there were moments when the sting of laughter lingered longer than he admitted. He bore it quietly, letting it settle in the margins of his sketchbook like shadows he could turn into shapes later. Evenings were quiet in the Ward household. Their small house at the edge of Ridgefield sat beside a stretch of woods where owls called after dark. Claire would sit at the kitchen table with her receipts, the light casting tired circles beneath her eyes, while Ethan finished his drawings in silence across from her. They spoke little, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a rhythm built on years of doing without yet carrying on. On weekends, he mowed the lawn, fixed what he could, and walked to the grocery store to help his mother carry bags home. The town saw him as a good kid, the kind who stayed out of trouble, but few noticed the way he carried more weight than most boys his age. What set Ethan apart most was his watchfulness. He saw when the old man at the diner winced while standing, when the mechanic slipped a couple bills under his coffee cup to pay for someone else's meal, when his mother straightened her shoulders before greeting a customer even after a long day. He noticed the silences as much as the words. It gave him a way of moving to the world quietly, as if always braced for something others didn't yet see. Ridgefield was a small place, predictable in its routines, but Ethan's eyes searched its corners as if waiting for the moment when that sameness would crack. The school day ended the way most did, with students spilling out of the brick building onto cracked sidewalks, their voices echoing in the cool Vermont air. Ethan walked at his usual pace, neither rushing to join the chatter nor lingering behind. His sketchbook was tucked under his arm, the worn cover marked with smudges from years of use. He had filled dozens like it since he was a child, each one crowded with faces, places, and moments he wanted to hold on to before they slipped away. Today, as most days, he turned his steps toward Miller's Diner, the old building that sat like a watchful neighbor at the center of town. The bell over the door jingled as he stepped inside, releasing the warmth and the familiar scent of coffee, fried onions, and pie crust into the crisp afternoon air. The sound of forks against plates and the steady murmur of voices wrapped around him in a way that felt steadier than the silence of home. The booths were half-filled, as they usually were at this hour, with workers finishing late lunches and older residents who came more for conversation than food. At the counter, Marlene, the head waitress with her hair pinned back in the same tight bun she had worn for decades, looked up and smiled faintly in recognition. Ethan gave a small nod in return. He never had much to order, often just a glass of milk or sometimes a single plate of fries, but the staff had long since accepted his presence as part of the diner's routine. He slid into a booth near the window, setting his sketchbook on the table and uncapping a pencil that had been sharpened down nearly to a stub. Outside, The gas station across the street flickered with its humming lights, a place that seemed louder, less steady, but still part of the same picture. Inside the diner, the rhythm of the afternoon unfolded. A pair of farmers at the corner booth spoke in low voices about the coming frost. A traveling salesman flipped through a newspaper, tapping his foot against the linoleum. The coffee machine hissed and sputtered, filling mugs that were immediately sweetened with cream and sugar. Ethan let the details sink into him before letting his pencil move. He sketched the angle of Marlene's shoulders as she leaned to refill a cup, the curve of the spoon in the salesman's hand, the faint slouch of the farmers who had worked harder than their posture could hide. To anyone else, it was an ordinary afternoon, but for Ethan, each detail mattered. The diner was more than a place to sit. It was a kind of anchor, a reminder that the town's pulse, however small, beat steadily here. He had grown up in these booths, first with his father, and later just with his mother, and now mostly alone. The worn cushions and sound of the bell above the door had become as familiar to him as the creak of the floorboards in his own house. As the minutes passed, the light outside shifted, casting long shadows through the window. Ethan shaded them carefully into his drawing, capturing the way the light fractured through the sugar jars on the counter, sending tiny prisms across the scratched surface of the diner's tables. He wasn't trying to make art that anyone else would praise. He drew, because it let him hold on to the fleeting. People came and went, conversations started and ended, but on the page they lingered. Every so often, someone passing by would glance at his sketchbook, curious, but Ethan rarely explained. He preferred to stay quiet, to let his drawing say what he couldn't. The diner gave him that freedom. Here, no one asked him to be louder or stronger or different. He could simply observe, and in observing, he found a place for himself. The hum of voices, the clatter of dishes, the scrape of chairs against linoleum. Together they formed the music of Ridgefield, a music he captured one line at a time. On that afternoon, nothing seemed unusual. The town carried on as it always had, steady and predictable. Ethan drew and listened, letting the rhythm of Miller's diner settle around him, unaware that within hours the calm he treasured would be broken, and the drawings in his book would capture more than just routine. They would capture the moment when his quiet life collided with something far louder. The first hint of trouble came not from inside the diner, but from the sound outside. It started low, a distant rumble that grew until it filled the air and shook the glass windows in their frames. Conversations faltered. Forks hovered above plates. Even the hiss of the coffee machine seemed smaller against the roar of engines pulling into the lot. Ethan's pencil froze midline. He knew that sound well enough from television shows and from the times he had heard it on the outskirts of town. Motorcycles. Not just one or two, but a group moving together like a single thunderous wave. The bell above the door gave its usual jingle, though the noise was nearly drowned by the slam of boots and the creak of leather. 6 men entered first, their jackets heavy with patches that meant little to Ridgefield locals but carried their own messages in louder places. Sunglasses stayed on even indoors, and the smell of gasoline and cigarettes trailed them as they fanned into the room. The warmth of the diner seemed to drop a few degrees. Marlene stiffened behind the counter, though her hand moved automatically to the pot of coffee, as if instinct alone could carry her through. The regulars shifted uneasily in their seats. The farmers who had been speaking quietly moments earlier now stared at their cups. The salesman folded his newspaper with deliberate care, his eyes fixed on the table as a reading print that was no longer there. In Ridgefield, confrontation was rare. Disagreement was usually settled with silence or a slow shake of the head. The entrance of these men carried an energy the room wasn't built to hold. Ethan watched them take over the diner, as if it belonged to them. 2 dropped into a booth near the window, boots up on the cushions without a thought. Another leaned on the counter, tapping a coin against the surface loud enough to make Marlene's hand tremble as she poured. The tallest of them, a broad man with a thick beard streaked gray, slapped the jukebox with the flat of his palm, sending a tinny burst of music into the air. Laughter followed, harsh and loud, filling the quiet spaces where conversation had been. No one told them to stop. Ridgefield wasn't the kind of town where people look for trouble, and most believed the quickest way to end it was to let it pass through on its own. But the longer the bikers stayed, the more their presence pressed down on the room. Their voices carried crude jokes, loud demands, and mocking whistles that made the waitress hurry when she usually took her time. The ordinary rhythm of the diner, steady and predictable, was broken, replaced by something jagged and uneasy. Ethan's pencil hovered above his sketchbook, the line unfinished. He didn't look directly at them, but his eyes caught every detail. The way their rings flashed when they drummed their fingers against the table, the way they leaned too close to Marlene as she refilled cups, the way laughter came sharp and mean. Around him, he felt the tension of adults who pretended not to notice, their silence as loud as the engines that still idled outside. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, though he sat as still as ever. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the bikers themselves or the way the people he knew, people he thought of as steady, folded into silence around them. It was as though the town's confidence had been lifted away in an instant, leaving only the weight of unease. The diner, his place of comfort, no longer felt steady. It felt like something fragile, at risk of shattering with the wrong word or glance. One of the bikers at the counter let his coin roll to the floor, bending to retrieve it with deliberate slowness, his grin wide as he straightened. His gaze swept across the room, daring anyone to meet it. Most looked away. Ethan kept his eyes on his sketchbook, though the blank page in front of him told the truth. His hand wouldn't move, his pencil still by the sudden shift in the air. Outside, the motorcycles waited, lined in a row like sentinels, their chrome catching the last of the daylight. Inside, the men spread their noise through every corner, filling the space with a kind of ownership that didn't need permission. Ridgefield's quiet afternoon was gone, replaced by something sharper, louder, and far less forgiving. The diner's air thickened with the weight of their voices, each laugh and barked word pressing harder against the room's walls. What had been a place of quiet conversation now trembled under the strain of noise meant to dominate, to remind everyone inside who held control. The waitress, Marlene, moved between tables with her notepad clenched tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had served in Ridgefield longer than some of the patrons had been alive, her patience and memory known to everyone. But facing these men, her hands trembled just enough for coffee to slosh in its pot. Milkshakes, one of them demanded, his voice rough and commanding. He slapped the table with a flat palm, rattling the cutlery that had been laid neatly moments before. Vanilla. No, make it chocolate. And hurry it up, sweetheart, we're thirsty. His companions laughed, the sound coarse and deliberate. Another added, better make 2 for me. Don't skimp on the ice cream, either. We came a long way. The orders overlapped, each louder than the last, as if competing not for the shakes themselves but for the discomfort they caused. Marlene scribbled quickly, nodding without meeting their eyes. She had endured men like this before, travelers, drifters, those who thought a small-town diner was theirs to push around. But rarely had they arrived in such a pack, feeding off one another's bravado until their noise filled every corner. As she moved toward the counter, one leaned back in his seat, calling after her, "And make it quick, Grandma. We ain't got all day." The others erupted again, slapping the table, stomping boots against the floor. The word hung cruelly in the air. Marlene's back stiffened, but she kept walking, her shoes clicking softly against the worn linoleum. The regulars sat frozen in place, eyes lowered. The farmers at the corner booth busied themselves with napkins, folding and refolding them as if it were their task for the afternoon. The salesman tapped his pen against the table in an uneven rhythm, his newspaper forgotten. No one spoke against the mockery. Their silence was its own shield, though thin and fragile, a way to survive the storm by pretending it might pass. Ethan sat near the window, his sketchbook open but untouched. He felt the sharp edge of each word thrown across the room, each laugh that followed. His pencil lay against the page, but his hand refused to move. He looked at Marlene, her shoulders hunched, her step smaller than usual, and something twisted inside him. He had known her since he was little, her voice one of the constants in his life. She had poured his milk and brought him fries with a smile, even when he hadn't more than $1 in his pocket. To see her bent under the jeers of strangers made the air taste bitter. Behind the counter, she worked quickly, pulling metal cups from their place, scooping ice cream with stiff motions, and adding milk with a hand that still trembled. The blender roared, drowning the room's noise for a moment, but when it stopped, the laughter surged again, louder, filling the silence left behind. One of the bikers called out, "Don't forget the whipped cream. We're classy fellas here." His companions howled at the joke. The jukebox sputtered another tune, clashing with their noise. Boots scraped against the floor as one of them rose to lean over the counter, watching Marlene as she poured shakes into tall glasses. "Come on, honey," he drawled. "Don't keep us waiting. We get cranky." His smile held no warmth. The shakes arrived at their table, heavy glasses set down with as much steadiness as Marlene could manage. One biker lifted his, taking a long sip before slamming it back on the table. "Not bad," he admitted, then added with a sneer, "Guess the old girl still has some use." The words landed hard, their weight sharper than the laughter that followed. Ethan's eyes flicked toward Marlene. For just a second, he saw the flicker of hurt in her face before she turned away. No one else seemed willing to notice. The diners kept their eyes down, their silence intact. Outside, the motorcycles gleamed in the fading light, a reminder that this noise and cruelty came back by power and steel. Inside, the mockery continued, riding on the backs of milkshakes and cheap laughter, until the diner no longer felt like Ridgefield's familiar refuge, but a stage seized by men who mistook cruelty for strength. The room seemed to shrink as the bikers settled deeper into their noise. Their laughter rolled across the booths, thick and unrestrained, spilling over the edges of conversation until nothing else could exist alongside it. The milkshake glasses clinked against the table as they drank loudly, each slurp and belch an announcement that the space belonged to them now. What was once the steady hum of Miller's diner, the scrape of forks, the shuffle of plates, the muted conversations, had dissolved into uneasy silence, broken only by the sharp edges of their voices. The regulars lowered their heads, finding refuge in the bottoms of their coffee cups. The farmers in the corner bent close to each other, pretending to discuss the weather, their words muffled and forced. One of them twisted the salt shaker in his hands until the glass squeaked beneath his grip. The salesman at the counter had abandoned his newspaper altogether, eyes fixed firmly on the black coffee that had long gone cold in front of him. He stirred it absently, though there was nothing left to dissolve. Each man in the diner understood what was happening, and each one chose the same defense. Silence, avoidance, the hope that if they didn't challenge the storm, it might pass through without noticing them. Marlene moved between tables with the cautious gait of someone walking across thin ice. She didn't pause, didn't meet anyone's gaze, simply carried plates and refilled mugs, her motions clipped and precise. The lines around her mouth deepened, though her expression never broke into open fear. She was a woman who had endured decades behind that counter, but endurance didn't make the weight of humiliation any lighter. Ethan saw it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she braced before approaching the biker's booth, as if every step toward them was a negotiation with herself to keep going. The air carried the sound of boots scraping against the floor as one of the bikers leaned back, stretching his legs out into the aisle. Customers stepped carefully around them, heads down, voices quiet. Even the jukebox seemed subdued now, its music fading into background like it too understood it had no place competing with this noise. The diner, Ridgefield's steady refuge, had become something else entirely, a place where the regular order no longer mattered, where the rhythm of the town had been broken by outsiders who thrived on disruption. Ethan watched from his booth, his sketchbook open but untouched. He caught every detail. The way the salesman's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his spoon, the way the farmer's words trailed into nothing when a biker's laugh cut across their table, the way Marlene's shoe scuffed softly as she moved faster than usual. It struck him how quickly the atmosphere had changed, how a room filled with people could feel so powerless once the air itself belonged to someone else. The adults he had always thought of as steady, the ones who carried the town on their backs, sat subdued, their strength hidden under lowered eyes. No one wanted confrontation. That was clear. Ridgefield wasn't built for it. Its people endured storms by waiting them out, trusting that they would pass with time. But these men didn't look like a passing storm. They looked rooted in their noise, drawing power from the silence that met them. Every moment that stretched on without a word of resistance seemed to tighten their hold on the diner, as though the crowd's submission was the very fuel they sought. Ethan felt the heaviness of it settle over him. He could hear his own heartbeat against the silence, steady but insistent. The sketchbook before him remained blank, his pencil resting against the page. Usually, he would fill the lines with details, the angle of a face, the shadow of a hand. But tonight, the details themselves felt too sharp to capture. He looked around and realized that the quiet of the crowd, once comforting, had become something else. It was fear, spread evenly across every table, and it had bound the room tighter than the laughter the bikers ever could. Ethan sat with his back pressed against the cool leather of the booth, his sketchbook open in front of him, though the page remained blank. His pencil rested in his hand, but it had not moved in minutes. The noise of the bikers filled the air, so loud and relentless it seemed to seep into his skin, but his eyes stayed sharp, moving from face to face, catching every detail that the others tried not to see. It was what he had always done. Watching, noticing, collecting small pieces of the world others overlooked. Only this time, what he saw left him torn between shrinking further into himself and standing up in a way he had never dared before. He saw the tremor in Marlene's hand as she carried another tray of milkshakes, her knuckles white around the edges of the glasses. He saw the way she placed them quickly on the table, careful not to linger long enough to invite another joke at her expense. He noticed a shift in her shoulders when one of the men muttered something under his breath, low enough that only she could hear. She did not respond, only turned on her heel and hurried back to the counter, her back stiff as if holding something in place. He saw the farmers in the corner booth, their weathered hands clutched around coffee mugs that no longer steamed. These were men who spent their days facing frost, broken machinery, and the endless demands of land that never gave easily, yet now they sat like children waiting out a storm. Their eyes stayed on their drinks, their voices stuck somewhere in their throats. He saw the salesman at the counter pick up his cup and set it down again, over and over, as if the motion alone would keep him invisible. Ethan's gaze drifted to the bikers themselves. He studied the way they leaned back in the booths, legs stretched wide, claiming space that wasn't theirs. He saw the rings on their fingers, heavy and sharp, glinting when they slapped the table. He noticed how their laughter always followed silence, how they seemed to feed on the discomfort of the room, pulling power from every lower head and every averted glance. They weren't just loud. They were measuring the room, waiting to see how far they could push before anyone dared to push back. A knot tightened in Ethan's chest as he realized no one would. Not the farmers, not the salesman, not even Marlene, who had stood her ground against worse storms than most people could imagine. They all wanted the same thing, for the moment to pass, for the men to drink their shakes, laugh their laughs, and leave. But as the bikers grew louder, sharper, crueler, it became clear that waiting would not end it. And in the hollow space where Adultia stood tall, Ethan felt something stir inside him. Fear pressed hard against him. He was only 15, his voice still unsteady, when it rose above a whisper. What could he possibly do against men twice his size, with their leather and their engines and their fists that seemed ready for trouble? His mother's voice echoed in his mind, the warnings she had given him over the years about picking battles carefully, about staying safe, about letting others handle the fights that weren't his. But here, in this room that had always been his refuge, he saw only silence, and he felt, against all reason, that silence itself was becoming dangerous. He lowered his eyes to the blank page in front of him. The paper as empty as the room's courage. His pencil hovered, but instead of drawing, he tightened his grip until it dug into his fingers. His chest rose and fell with breaths that felt heavier than they should. The fear told him to stay quiet, to disappear into the background as he had always done. Yet another voice, quieter but steadier, whispered that maybe it mattered who spoke first, that maybe even someone small could make the silence break. His eyes lifted again, moving across the room. Marlene, fighting to steady her hands. The farmers, swallowed in their own quiet. The salesman, waiting for something that wouldn't come. Ethan realized he was watching not just what people did, but what they failed to do. And with each passing moment, the weight of it pressed harder on him, until he felt it settle like a responsibility he had not chosen, but one that had somehow landed squarely in his lap. Ethan's eyes lingered on the bikers' table one last time. He traced every detail. The way their jackets creaked when they leaned, the gleam of milkshake on one man's beard, the smirk that curled in another's lips as he drummed a heavy ring against the glass. He saw them all, and more than that, he understood what they were doing. They weren't here just to drink or to eat. They were here to remind a room of quiet people that power belonged to the loudest voice. And in that realization, Ethan's chest filled with something sharper than fear, something that felt a lot like defiance waiting for a place to breathe. The laughter had grown sharper, rising and falling in waves that drowned out the natural hum of the diner. It had been going on so long that the unease had settled like a permanent shadow across the room. People barely lifted their forks now, and every clink of silverware seemed too loud, too risky, as though even ordinary sounds might draw the bikers' attention. Ethan sat with his pencil unmoving, his eyes tracking every movement. He knew the tension couldn't stretch forever. Something would snap. The moment came quietly at first. The man in the far corner, an elderly figure who had sat alone since before the bikers arrived, tried to finish his meal unnoticed. His back was stooped, his shoulders narrow under a faded jacket, and the bill of his cap shielded most of his face. The cap itself was plain except for the embroidered words stitched across the front, Vietnam veteran. He had eaten slowly, deliberately, as though determined not to be rushed by the noise around him. For a time, it seemed the bikers hadn't noticed him, but silence, Ethan realized, was a magnet for men who lived off disruption. One of them spotted the old man when he rose to stretch, his boots scraping the floor with a screech. He nudged the biker beside him, gesturing with a tilt of his chin. Their laughter grew low and mean. "Hey, look at Grandpa over there," the first one called out, his voice slicing across the room. Didn't know they served war stories with the soup. The others snorted, some pounding fists on the table for emphasis. The veteran didn't respond. He kept his eyes on his plate, moving his fork with quiet dignity. That silence, though, seemed to egg him on. The tallest of the group, the one with a streaked beard, pushed himself up from the booth and strode across the room with heavy steps that made the floor tremble. Every head lowered further. Marlene froze behind the counter. Coffee pot clutched midair. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched the man stop at the corner table, looming over the veteran like a shadow. "What's the matter, old-timer? Can't hear me?" The biker jeered. His voice dripped with mockery, loud enough to fill the silence. "That your army hat? Or just something you wear so people buy you free coffee?" His companions howled from their seats, egging him on. The old man set down his fork carefully, still not raising his eyes. His silence was steady, almost deliberate, but it only stoked the biker's cruelty. With a sudden shove, he pressed a broad hand against the veteran's shoulder, forcing him back into the booth. The jolt knocked the cap from his head. It hit the floor with a soft thud, rolling to rest near the biker's boot. The room seemed to inhale all at once. For Ethan, the sound of that cap hitting the floor was louder than the roar of motorcycles outside. His eyes fixed on it, the fabric worn from years of use, the stitched letters faded but unmistakable. It was more than cloth. It was history, sacrifice, dignity, and now it lay in the dirt at the feet of a man who had no respect for any of it. The biker nudged it with his boot, grinning down at the veteran. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Guess you dropped something, hero." The veteran lifted his gaze at last, and Ethan caught the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was weariness. The kind carried by someone who had already fought battles far worse than this, but who now lacked the strength or perhaps the desire to rise for one more. That look cut Ethan deeper than the shove itself. It was as if the old man was resigned to let this insult pass, to let dignity fall with the cap, rather than risk more violence. The silence from the rest of the diner was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. The farmers stared into their cups. The salesman's hand trembled against the spoon, and even Marlene looked stricken, her lips parted but words caught in her throat. The room's fear had paralyzed them all, and in that paralysis, cruelty had been allowed to reign. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He felt himself trembling, though he remained seated, his hands clenched tight around his pencil and sketchbook. He wasn't supposed to be the one. He was just a boy, 15 and uncertain, but the weight in his chest grew heavier with every second the cap lay on the floor. He thought of his father, of the lessons whispered in small moments before he was gone, about respect, about standing when it mattered, and he thought of his mother, working double shifts, so he could have a life she believed was worth more than silence. The biker leaned lower, his grin cruel. "Go on, old man," he said. "Pick it up." The words hung there, daring, mocking. Ethan could hardly breathe. The room had reached its breaking point. Something had to give. The cap still lay on the floor, its brim bent at an awkward angle where the biker's boot had nudged it aside. The old man stared at it for a long moment, his face lined with quiet humiliation he tried to mask, but his silence only deepened the power of the mockery. The biker smirked, waiting, enjoying the spectacle. The rest of the diner held his collective breath. Every patron weighed down by the same fear that had kept them still since the men arrived. No one moved. No one spoke. The room itself seemed frozen, caught between the cruelty of the shove and the unbearable quiet that followed. Ethan felt the tension inside him coil tighter than it ever had before. His fingers dug into the spine of his sketchbook, his knuckles pale. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breath uneven, but beneath the fear something steadier pressed upward, insistent and sharp. His heart pounded as if it wanted to climb into his throat, and for a moment he thought he might choke on it. But then, before he had time to second-guess himself, his voice slipped out into the silence. "Pick it up yourself." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The room was so quiet that even his hushed defiance carried across it, landing with a weight that felt heavier than their volume. Heads turned toward him, eyes wide in disbelief. The farmers straightened in their seats as if they'd misheard. The salesman froze with his spoon halfway to the cup. Marlene's breath caught audibly behind the counter. For the first time since the bikers entered, silence belonged to someone other than them. Ethan's throat burned as the words left him. His voice had come out steadier than he expected, though the trembling in his chest betrayed how much effort it took to hold it there. He didn't look down at the cap or at the floor. He kept his eyes on the biker, though every part of him screamed to look away. The man turned slowly, disbelief flashing across his face before twisting into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Well, the biker said, his tone mockingly amused. "Look at this. Kid thinks he's got to say." His companions chuckled, their laughter echoing like a chorus of hyenas. But the grin faltered just enough to reveal the truth. He hadn't expected anyone to speak, least of all a boy. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten, but he didn't let himself shrink back. His legs pressed against the underside of the booth, steadying him, grounding him. He knew he was shaking, but he forced his voice again, stronger this time. "You don't treat him like that. Not here." The biker's laughter rose, but beneath it, the atmosphere had shifted. The other patrons were watching now, eyes no longer hidden in cups or napkins. The old man lifted his head, surprise flickering across his tired features as he studied Ethan, as though measuring the courage he hadn't expected to see. The biker took a step toward Ethan's booth, his boots heavy against the floor. "You got a problem, kid?" he asked, his voice lower now, edged with something less certain than before. He leaned forward, hands gripping the table's edge, his face close enough for Ethan to see the lines carved deep around his mouth. Ethan's palms sweated against the sketchbook, but he didn't move them. He held the man's stare, though his insides quaked. Every instinct told him to drop his eyes, to apologize, to retreat into the silence the others had chosen. But he couldn't. Something had cracked inside him when that cap hit the floor, something he couldn't mend by pretending he hadn't seen. "You should leave him alone," Ethan said, his voice thinner now, but it didn't falter. The words came out like a thread pulled tight, trembling yet unbroken. The biker's grin widened again, but his eyes narrowed. He straightened slowly, turning back toward his table, forcing a laugh that rang more hollow than before. "Hear that, boys? Kid's got manners. Wants to teach us how to behave." His companions chuckled, but not as loud this time. Something in the boys' defiance had cut through the theater of their dominance. For Ethan, the moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, his toes curled over the drop, the ground trembling beneath him. Fear still gnawed at him, but he had spoken. He had broken the silence that had suffocated the room. And though his body trembled with the enormity of it, he realized something important. Fear had not stopped his words. They had come anyway, and they had landed where they needed to. The old veteran bent slowly, retrieving his cap from the floor with quiet dignity. He brushed the dust from its brim and set it back on his head. His eyes lifted to Ethan across the room, and in that brief meeting of gazes, there was something unspoken: recognition, gratitude, and a reminder that courage could be borrowed and shared even across generations. The diner seemed to hold its breath after Ethan spoke, the sound of his words still echoing faintly in the corners. For a moment, there was only silence, a heavy pause where no one seemed to know what would happen next. Then the bikers erupted, their laughter breaking out in a sudden roar that filled every inch of the room. It was not the laughter of men who had heard a good joke, but the kind meant to humiliate, to grind someone smaller beneath the weight of sound. It came in sharp bursts and long howls, rattling the windows and bouncing off the walls until it felt as though the entire diner was shaking with it. "Listen to this kid," one shouted, slapping the table so hard the milkshake glasses jumped. "Little man wants to play hero." Another leaned back in his booth, pointing at Ethan with a finger heavy with rings. "What's it you got, boy? A sketchbook? Gonna draw us a picture of how tough you are." His companions bellowed again, their voices overlapping in ugly chorus. The tallest of them leaned his weight on the counter, his grin spreading wide. "Hey, sweetheart," he called to Marlene, jerking his thumb toward Ethan. "You hear that? Boy thinks he runs the place. Better watch out, or he might take your job." The cruelty in his tone made the regulars shrink further into their seats. The sound of laughter rolling through the room made Ethan's insides twist, but he held himself still, his hands tight on the sketchbook in front of him. Every jeer cut sharper than the last, but beneath them was a rhythm of disbelief. They hadn't expected anyone to speak, least of all a teenager. Their noise, though loud, carried a note of defense, as if mocking was the only way to smother the fact that he had dared to challenge them. They leaned on their laughter as though it could erase the sting of his words, as though volume could cover cracks forming in their authority. Ethan's heart hammered so hard it felt like it might shake the table, but he refused to lower his eyes. He stared at the edge of the booth across from him, keeping his gaze steady, even if he couldn't bring himself to meet the biker's eyes directly. Fear threatened to close his throat, but he swallowed it down, forcing himself to breathe slowly. His voice might have been small, his frame slight, but in that moment he understood the power of not retreating. He had spoken, and he would not take it back. One of the bikers dragged his chair loudly across the floor and stood, stretching as though preparing for a show. "Come on, kid, say it again," he taunted, spreading his arms. "Tell us how we're supposed to behave. Maybe we should take notes. Maybe you can teach us all some manners." His friends howled once more, their laughter spilling like a wave over the room. The farmers in the corner shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The salesman's hand shook so badly he nearly spilled his cup, but he kept his head bowed. Marlene moved behind the counter with mechanical precision, her face pale but her eyes flicking once toward Ethan before quickly lowering again. No one else dared to step in, and the silence of the crowd only gave the bikers more room to mock, their laughter swelling higher and higher. Ethan's cheeks burned, the sound pressing against him from all sides, but he did not move. Inside, fear still clung to him, but alongside it grew something stronger, a stubborn refusal to shrink, to let them turn him into a joke. He gripped his pencil so tightly that it threatened to snap. The bikers could laugh, could howl until their voices broke, but they could not erase the words he had already spoken. The silence they had fed upon was gone now, broken once and for all, and though their laughter filled the room, it could not return things the way they had been. The old veteran in the corner adjusted his cap slowly, his eyes locked on Ethan. There was no laughter in his face, only a quiet recognition of what had just happened. Ethan felt it, even through the wall of noise, a silent connection, a reminder that someone had heard his voice and understood it for what it was. The bikers' laughter thundered on, cruel and unrelenting, but Ethan realized something as he sat in the booth, trembling yet unbroken. Their noise was loud, but it was also hollow. They were mocking him because they had to, because the alternative was to admit that a boy's voice had pierced their grip on the room. That thought gave him the smallest measure of strength, enough to sit taller, enough to breathe without shaking. Their laughter might echo for minutes, but his words, he knew, would linger long after the sound had faded. The laughter of the bikers rolled on until it began to sound forced, as though they were trying to convince themselves as much as a crowd that the boy was nothing more than a joke. Yet even as their voices boomed, Ethan did not move. He sat in his booth with his sketchbook in front of him, his shoulders straight despite the tremor in his chest. The ridicule washed over him, but he refused to bend. When the noise finally began to ebb, his voice returned to the silence they had left behind. "Leave him alone." The words were quiet, but in the fragile stillness of the diner, they cut through like a blade. The mockery faltered. A few of the bikers chuckled half-heartedly, but the sound no longer had the same weight. The boy's words, steady though soft, carried a sharpness that silence alone could not dull. His voice didn't rise, didn't strain for dominance. It simply existed, small and undeniable, and that was enough to shift the air. The tall one with the streaked beard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as if he had misheard. "What was that?" he asked, his tone no longer playful. He took a heavy step toward Ethan's booth, the floor groaning under his weight. His companions hooted again, trying to rebuild a wall of noise, but their leader kept his gaze fixed on the boy. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears, but he met the man's stare without looking away. His throat was dry, his palms damp against the sketchbook. Yet his words came again, firmer this time. "I said leave him alone. You don't get to treat him like that." The room held still as the statement hung in the air. Every pair of eyes shifted toward Ethan, some wide with disbelief, others filled with fear. Marlene froze behind the counter, the coffee pot trembling in her hand. The farmers in the corner looked stricken, as though the boy's defiance might spill over and drag them into something far larger than they could control. The salesman's spoon clinked against his cup, the sound too loud in the hush. The old veteran, cap now back on his head, said nothing, but his gaze was steady, fixed not on the bikers but on the boy who had spoken for him. The tall biker rested both hands on Ethan's table, leaning close enough that the boy could smell the mix of leather, smoke, and beer on his breath. "You've got guts," he muttered, though his tone was edged with something darker. "But guts don't keep your teeth in your mouth." The threat lingered, a heavy suggestion of violence. His friends laughed again, but even their laughter seemed to hesitate, waiting to see how the boy would respond. Ethan's body shook beneath the surface, but his words came out without faltering. "Then do it," he said, his voice sharp and unadorned. "Hit a kid. See how far that gets you." The statement struck harder than a shout might have. It was not loud, not desperate, but matter-of-fact, and it turned the weight of the threat back on the man who had made it. A ripple of unease moved through the diner. The regulars shifted in their seats. Even the bikers exchanged glances, their laughter fading into murmurs. No one had expected the boy to stand so firmly. The tall man straightened slowly, his grin strained now, his eyes colder. He tapped his rings against the tabletop, the metallic sound echoing like a warning. "Careful," he said. "You don't know who you're talking to." "I know enough," Ethan answered. His voice shook at the edges now, but the words themselves were clear. He didn't raise them, didn't match the man's volume, but he didn't back down either. The standoff stretched long, the diner suspended in its tension. The boy sat unmoving, the man looming above him, the room filled with a kind of silence that feels like it might break under its own weight. Outside, the motorcycles gleamed in the fading light, waiting like sentinels for whatever came next. Inside, every person watched, breath held, wondering who would blink first. And still, Ethan did not bend. His words, though simple, had planted themselves in the room, sharp enough to pierce through the noise, steady enough to remind everyone that even a boy's voice could draw a line that cruelty could not cross without consequence. The diner's silence stretched until it seemed to creak beneath the weight of it. The tall biker still loomed over Ethan, his rings glinting faintly in the fluorescent light as he drummed his fingers against the table. His grin had thinned into something colder, but his posture was no longer casual. The boy's words had left a mark, and everyone in the room felt it. Still no one moved. The regulars stayed frozen in their seats, unwilling to break the fragile balance. Only one pair of eyes shifted with purpose. The old man's in the corner, the veteran whose cap had been shoved to the floor minutes earlier. He had been quiet since the bikers came in, sitting alone with the last of his meal cooling on the plate. His silence had not been weakness but weariness, the sort of quiet carried by someone who had seen more battles than most could imagine. He had let their laughter wash over him, let their insults fall like dull blows, because men who lived through war often know the futility of sparring with the loud. But now, as he watched the boy sit firm in his booth, words sharp despite the tremor in his frame, something stirred in him that he had thought long gone. His gaze fixed on Ethan with a steadiness that cut through the chaos. The boy did not see it at first. His eyes were locked on the man towering over him. But a veteran studied him with the precision of someone taking measure, cataloging every detail. He saw the boy's jaw clench hard enough to ache, his knuckles white against the sketchbook, his shoulders squared not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was. The veteran knew that kind of posture. He had worn it himself once, in jungles and villages far from home, when the only thing keeping a man upright was a refusal to let fear decide for him. Around them, the bikers laughed louder, trying to fill the silence with sound, but the old man wasn't listening to them. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in recognition, as though the boy had unlocked a memory long buried. He remembered being young, far younger than the uniform had any right to demand, standing in a line with others who shook as hard as he did, waiting for orders that would send them into fire. He remembered how courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it anyway. And in this boy's quiet defiance, in his refusal to look away, he saw that same decision unfolding. The veteran's chest tightened as he realized how long it had been since he'd witnessed something so small yet so absolute. He had thought that kind of resolve belonged only to soldiers, to men tempered by war. Yet here it was, in the booth of a small-town diner, carried not by a man with stripes on his shoulder, but by a 15-year-old boy with sketchbook. It was unexpected, and for a moment it left him almost breathless. Ethan felt the weight of the biker's stare pressing down on him, but then, faintly, he sensed another gaze, different, steady, almost grounding. He turned his head just enough to see the veteran watching him. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the noise around them seemed to fade. The boy saw no pity there, no expectation that he should back down. What he saw instead was recognition, a kind of respect that made the trembling in his chest settle. The veteran gave nothing more than a slight nod, so small it could have been mistaken for the settling of his cap, but it carried a weight Ethan felt as surely as if the man had spoken aloud. In that look was something unspoken, a transfer of strength that didn't need words. The boy had given voice to what the room had lost, and the old soldier, silent for so long, acknowledged it as though it were a salute. Ethan straightened a little more, his breath steadying the presence of that gaze like a hand on his shoulder. The bikers continued their jeers, their laughter still loud, but for the veteran and the boy, the moment had shifted. They were no longer just witness and actor. They were bound in a shared understanding. The old man, once resigned to endure, had been reminded of something he thought buried in the past. And Ethan, uncertain and afraid, found that the eyes of a man who had survived real battles saw him as something more than a boy. The standoff had not ended. The threat still hung heavy in the air. But beneath it, in the quiet exchange between youth and age, a new strength had taken root. One that would not fade even when the laughter of grown men tried to drown it. The air inside the diner felt brittle, as if the smallest movement might cause it to crack. The laughter of the bikers had already lost some of its edge, but the room was still theirs, claimed by noise and presence. The tall one with the streaked beard had not moved far from Ethan's booth, his grin stretched too thin now, his eyes restless. His companions filled the silence with mutters and jeers, but even they seemed to sense the balance tilting. The veteran still sat in his corner, silent but unyielding, and Ethan remained upright in his seat, refusing to bend. It was enough to irritate men who thrived on control. The irritation showed in sudden violence. One of the bikers at the counter, a thick-set man with tattoos crawling up his arms, brought his fist down hard on the surface. The plates stacked nearby rattled violently, forks clinking against porcelain, one glass nearly toppling to the floor. The sound tore through the room like a gunshot. Every patron flinched. The farmers jerked in their booth. The salesman's spoon clattered onto his saucer, and even Marlene froze mid-step. Coffee pot tilted dangerously before she set it down with trembling hands. The biker grinned wide at the reaction, his teeth yellowed under the lights. "That's better," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Now we've got everyone's attention." He turned his head toward Ethan, his stare narrowing into something colder. You think you're brave, kid? You think a few words make you bigger than you are? Try standing when someone like me decides he doesn't like your mouth. Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't expected the sudden slam, and the shock of it reverberated through him. His hands clenched harder around his pencil and sketchbook, grounding himself. He wanted to shrink back into the booth, to disappear as he'd done so many times in the hallways at school when words or shoves came his way. But he couldn't. Not here, not with the cap still fresh in his mind, not with the veteran's steady eyes on him. He drew in a breath, shallow but steady, and managed to hold his seat, refusing to flinch any further than the others already had. The tall leader stepped closer to the counter, joining the man who had slammed his fist. He tapped the surface with a ringed finger, slow and deliberate, each metallic click echoing across the silence. "This is how it works, boy," he said. "Loud voices make the rules. Strong hands keep them. And little mouths like yours learn when it's shut." His words dripped with contempt. But behind them was a thread of impatience, the kind that grows when intimidation doesn't land as expected. Ethan swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper, but he forced it out. "Strong hands don't make you right." The statement was simple, almost too quiet, but it carried. The silence of the diner caught it, held it, and passed it around until it felt louder than the slam had been. A murmur rippled among the bikers, their bravado shaken. The one at the counter leaned back slightly, but the tall one pressed forward, unwilling to let the moment slip. He slammed his palm flat on the counter, rattling the dishes again, then leaned close enough that Ethan could see the red veins in his eyes. "You want to learn the hard way?" he asked, his voice a growl. Ethan's heart raced so fast it hurt, but his gaze did not falter. He didn't answer this time. Silence itself became his refusal, and that silence, sharp and defiant, carried its own weight. Around them, the diners remained frozen, but their fear had shifted. It was no longer just fear of the bikers. It was awe, shaken, uncertain awe, at the boy who sat unmoving in the storm. The plate still quivered faintly on the counter, as though holding the echo of the fist that had struck them. The tension hung so sharp it seemed to cut the very air, waiting for the next sound to shatter it completely. The counter still trembled from the blow, the dishes rattling faintly as though remembering the violence that had struck them. The tall biker leaned close, his grin thin, his eyes daring Ethan to crumble. The man's presence was suffocating. His leather jacket creaked with each shift, the sharp smell of smoke and sweat hanging between them. The entire diner seemed to wait for the boy to fold, to bow his head and retreat into the silence that had kept everyone else safe. But Ethan did not move. His heart pounded so loud, he thought it might give him away, yet his body remained firm against the booth. He could feel the fear rushing through him. But something deeper rooted him in place, a weight that steadied his voice when he finally spoke. "I'm not afraid of you." The words weren't shouted, not even loud, but they cut through the tension like glass. They came out steady, clearer than anything he had said before, and for a moment they startled even him. The room, so brittle with silence, seemed to freeze around those words. The farmers stopped fidgeting with their napkins. The salesman's trembling hand stilled above his cup. Marlene, halfway through reaching for another pot, stopped entirely, her eyes locked on the boy she had known since he was small. Even the veteran in the corner, whose face had remained impassive, allowed the faintest shift in expression, his eyes narrowing in recognition. The biker blinked, his smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back. He straightened slightly, his rings tapping against the counter, as if he needed the sound to cover his hesitation. "Not afraid, huh?" he said, his voice pitched to mockery, but the edge of unease was there. "You think that makes you tough? That makes you a man." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, not out of strategy, but because he was still steadying his breath. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the weight of their collective disbelief, but also their hunger for something, anything, that pushed back against the noise that had drowned them all. Finally, he lifted his chin just enough and said, "It makes me honest." The simple words landed like a stone in a still pond. They didn't sound like bravado, didn't carry the swagger of a challenge. They were plain, spoken without embellishment, but their truth rang louder than the biker's threats. The man's grin flickered again, his eyes narrowing further. For the first time since entering, he seemed uncertain, as though the script he had written for the evening no longer matched the lines being delivered. His companions tried to fill the gap with laughter, but it rang thinner now, forced and brittle. They slapped the table, jeered half-heartedly, but none of it carried the same weight as before. Their leader's hesitation had weakened them, and though the boy was still just a boy, his steadiness had shifted the balance. Ethan's chest still burned with fear, but he realized something as he sat unmoving. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't looked away when the biker leaned in close, hadn't folded when the counter rattled under a fist. His words had not wavered, and in that steadiness he found a strength he hadn't known he possessed. It wasn't that fear had left him. It was still there, heavy and pulsing, but he had learned in that instant that fear didn't have to decide for him. The biker took a step back, muttering something under his breath, his fists clenching and unclenching as though trying to decide whether to push harder or retreat. The room remained taut, the silence sharp, but everyone could feel it. The boy had drawn a line. He had refused to bend, and in doing so, he had exposed fragility of the noise that had ruled the diner. Ethan sat taller, his breath steadier now, his voice still lingering in the air. He was no bigger than before, no older, but he no longer felt small. He felt anchored, as if his refusal to flinch had rooted him deeper into floor than any shove could dislodge. And though the night was far from over, the balance had shifted. The boy had spoken. He had stood firm, and nothing the bikers did next could erase that truth. The diner seemed to hold its breath, stretched thin between the boy's quiet defiance and the bikers' uncertain laughter. Plates still trembled faintly on the counter, the echoes of the fist that had slammed them not yet faded. The tall biker hovered near Ethan's booth, his weight shifting from one foot to the other as if trying to recover the dominance he had momentarily lost. His companions jeered again, but their voices were thinner now, carried more by habit than conviction. The room was still theirs in sound, but it no longer felt entirely in their grasp. Something had cracked, and in the silence between words, everyone could feel it. Behind the counter, Marlene moved with deliberate care. Her hands, though steady in appearance, betrayed themselves in the faint tremor of the coffee pot she set back on its burner. She had been serving in Ridgefield for longer than most could remember, weathering storms of drunks and travelers, but she had never seen the air quite like this. So brittle it might shatter with the next breath. Her eyes flicked from Ethan, straight back to his booth, to the men sprawled across the diner with their boots on tables, to the veteran in the corner, whose silence felt heavier than words. She knew something had to give. The phone hung on the wall behind her, an old rotary model that rarely rang anymore except for delivery calls. But just below the counter, half hidden from sight, lay a second line installed years ago after a spate of break-ins had shaken the town. It was hardly ever touched. Tonight, she found her hand hovering near it, her body angled slightly to shield her movement. Her breath came shallow, her chest tight with fear, but she leaned closer, her lips forming the faintest whisper. "Now," she murmured, so soft it was swallowed almost instantly by the clamor of the bikers. No one at their tables noticed. They were too busy trying to rebuild their theater of noise, pounding on glasses, mocking Ethan's defiance with forced laughter. But the farmers in the corner caught it, their eyes flicking up briefly before dropping again. The salesman at the counter stiffened. The veteran did not move, though his gaze sharpened just enough to show he had heard. Marlene bent slightly, her hand slipping under the counter, fingers brushing the receiver. She lifted it with care, the faint scrape drowned beneath another burst of laughter. Her other hand pressed quickly at the dial, the numbers spinning in a practiced rhythm. The noise of the bikers masked the faint clicks as she spoke in a hushed tone, her voice no louder than breath. "Trouble at Miller's," she said. "Send someone fast." She replaced the receiver with the same care, sliding it back into place without a sound. Her shoulders eased slightly, but her face revealed nothing. She moved again with her usual routine, wiping at the counter with a cloth, pouring coffee into a mug no one had asked for. To any casual glance, she was only a waitress, keeping herself busy, avoiding trouble. But beneath her stillness, her pulse raced, and the quiet knowledge that help was on its way steadied her just enough to keep moving. Ethan, though too far to hear her words, caught the flicker of her movement, For a second, he thought she had simply sought refuge in work, the way she always did when the diner grew tense. But when he saw her glance, quick, sharp, purposeful, toward the door, something inside him settled. He realized she was not only afraid, she was preparing. The bikers remained oblivious, too wrapped in their own noise. One raised his glass and shouted for another milkshake, his voice booming, while another banged the table with his fists. Their laughter rolled out again, but it rang hollow now, a performance no one cared to applaud. The room's silence, once their greatest weapon, was no longer entirely theirs. It had shifted, cracked by a boy's voice and reinforced by the quiet strength of a woman who had decided enough was enough. Marlene straightened her apron, her lips pressed tight, and whispered once more to herself, barely audible even to her own ears, "Hold on." And though no one else in the diner moved, the balance of the night had shifted again. Fear still hung heavy, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had become waiting for the next sound, the next door to open, the next turn that would decide if Ridgefield's quiet heart could hold against the storm that had rolled in on engines. The laughter inside the diner had begun to stretch thin, as though even the men who made it could sense that its strength was waning. It rose and fell in ragged bursts, more habit than dominance now, a wall of noise meant to keep fear in place. Ethan sat rigid in his booth, his hands still tight on the edge of his sketchbook, while the tall biker loomed above him, restless in his stance. The air had not softened. If anything, it felt sharper, more brittle. But there was a new undercurrent moving quietly beneath it. Marlene's whisper behind the counter. The small act of dialing a hidden phone lingered in the background like a secret pulse. The crowd waited in silence, unwilling to break it. Then, faint at first, came another sound from outside. It started low, steady, the hum of engines rolling down Ridgefield's narrow street. Not the wild roar that had rattled the diner earlier, but a deeper, more measured growl, its rhythm even and deliberate. The difference was unmistakable. The bikers inside fell silent mid-laugh, their heads tilting toward the door, ears straining. For a moment, no one moved. The sound grew louder, approaching in steady unison, like boots marching in formation. Ethan felt the vibrations on the soles of his shoes, a muted tremor that carried to the diner floorboards. He looked up, eyes darting to the windows, where faint light from passing headlights flickered against the glass. His chest tightened, though not from fear this time. It was something else, anticipation, a sense that the brittle balance inside the diner was about to shift again. The veteran in the corner lifted his head, his posture changing in a way that did not go unnoticed. He had sat quietly through it all, his silence heavy, his hands folded loosely in front of him. But now his eyes sharpened, and for the first time since the bikers arrived, his expression shifted. Recognition flickered there, recognition and something almost like relief. His ears, trained long ago to measure the weight of engines, caught the difference before anyone else. These were not the reckless revs of rowdy men looking for a stage. These were controlled, steady, familiar. His lips pressed together, not in fear, but in a thin, unreadable line. Outside, the engines cut abruptly, replaced by the sound of kickstands slamming down against asphalt. Boots struck the pavement in a rhythm that carried through the thin diner walls. The bikers inside exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado dimming as the air outside pressed against the glass. One muttered a curse under his breath, shifting in his seat. Another adjusted his jacket, his eyes darting toward the door as though measuring whether to leave or to wait. Ethan noticed a change in them instantly. Their laughter had faltered before, but this was different. The swagger in their shoulders sagged, the certainty in their voices thinned. They knew the sound of those engines as well as the veteran did, though their recognition came not with relief but with unease. Whoever was outside wasn't cut from the same cloth as them. The veteran leaned forward slightly, his cap catching the light. His gaze moved to the door, his jaw tight. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken since the evening began, but his silence no longer felt weary. It felt steady, braced, as though the moment he had been waiting for was finally arriving. His fingers drummed once against the table, slow, deliberate, before going still again. The regulars sat motionless, unsure what the new sound meant, but instinctively aware that it carried weight. The farmers glanced toward the window, their eyes wide. The salesman shifted nervously on his stool, his hand halfway to his coffee cup before pulling back again. Even Marlene, who had steeled herself with quiet action moments earlier, stood frozen behind the counter, her hand still pressed against the towel she hadn't realized she was gripping. The tall biker broke the silence first, his voice lower now, muttering to his companions. "Stay cool," he said, though the edge in his tone betrayed command. Probably nothing. But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the door, betraying his unease. The sound outside grew heavier as the boots approached the entrance. A faint jingle of the diner's bell echoed in the memory of everyone seated, but this time it hadn't rung yet. They all waited, caught in the suspended moment before the door opened. The veteran's eyes did not leave the door. For the first time all evening, his silence was no longer resignation. It was expectation. He knew those engines. He knew that steady rhythm. And though he said nothing, the weight of recognition in his gaze was enough to suggest to anyone watching that the balance inside the diner was about to shift in a way none of them had expected. The door of the diner creaked before the bell above it gave its familiar chime, a sound that usually blended into the rhythm of the place, but now cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned toward it. The rowdy bikers, who had claimed the space with laughter and noise, fell quiet as the door swung wide. A cold draft entered first, sweeping in the smell of exhaust and autumn air, and then came the men who carried with them a different kind of weight. They stepped inside one by one, not in a rush, not with the raucous energy of the group already seated, but with measured calm. Their boots struck the linoleum floor evenly, each step deliberate. They wore leather vests, but these were not decorated with skulls or crude patches meant to intimidate. Instead, their backs and chests bore insignia that spoke of years of service, embroidered eagles, unit numbers, flags, and names stitched carefully into fabric worn smooth by time. Some patches were faded, the colors dulled, but the meaning was unmistakable. They were marks of men who had lived under a different code, who had carried weight heavier than drunken boasts. The fluorescent lights of the diner caught the silver strands in their hair, the lined faces that carried not only age but memory. They were older, their bodies broader at the shoulders, slower in gait, but their presence filled the room without need for noise. The laughter of the bikers had evaporated the moment the door opened, and now the only sound was the steady rhythm of boots moving toward the counter. The first of them paused just inside the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room. They were sharp eyes, the kind that measured everything in silence before deciding where to stand. Behind him came another, his vest patched with a simple word across the front, Army. A third adjusted his cap, a subdued piece of cloth that bore the Marine Corps emblem. They didn't posture. They didn't grin. They entered as if they had been called to a duty that required nothing more than their presence. The veteran who had sat quietly in the corner straightened his booth, his posture shifting with recognition. He didn't raise a hand, didn't call out, but something in his eyes lit as he saw them. It wasn't surprise, it was familiarity, the look of a man who understood the sound of those engines long before the door opened. His gaze met the one leading the group, and a silent acknowledgement passed between them. No words, only a nod, but it carried the weight of decades. The bikers who had spent the evening filling the air with jeers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One pulled his boots off the cushion of the booth. Another cleared his throat, as if searching for a laugh that wouldn't come. The tall leader who had loomed over Ethan now stood straighter, his jaw tight, his smirk gone. He knew what those patches meant, even if he pretended not to. The difference between noise and presence was now undeniable. Ethan sat frozen, his eyes wide as he watched the men enter. He felt the weight of their arrival in his chest, a steadiness that calmed the trembling he had been fighting all evening. He didn't know their names, didn't know their stories, but he recognized what they carried into the room. It was the same thing he had seen in the old man's eyes when their gazes met, a kind of strength born not from size or noise, but from standing firm when it mattered most. Marlene, behind the counter, exhaled quietly, her hand loosening around the towel she had been gripping. The farmers in the corner sat up straighter, their eyes following the group as though relief had slipped in with them. Even the salesman at the counter, who had spent the evening staring at his cup, dared to lift his head. The older men stopped in the center of the diner, their silence heavy purposeful. They didn't have to ask what was happening. It was written across the room. The fear in the regulars' faces, the tension in the air, the way the younger bikers sat stiff, their bravado stripped. The leader of the veterans let his eyes settle on the tall biker by Ethan's booth. He didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. His presence and the patches stitched to his vest spoke for him. And in that silence, something shifted again. The diner no longer belonged to men who had filled it with noise. It belonged to the quiet weight of those who had just stepped inside. The air in the diner shifted the instant the older men finished stepping inside. They did not speak, did not raise their voices, but their presence filled the space in a way that made sound unnecessary. Their boots found steady ground, their vests caught the light, and their eyes moved across the room with quiet calculation. It was a silence that carried weight, the kind forged not in empty posturing, but in years of standing in places where silence had been the only shield against chaos. The rowdy bikers, who had filled the diner with jeers and laughter, seemed suddenly smaller in their seats. Their noise drained from them in increments, laughter faltering into smirks, smirks flattening into tight lines across their faces. One adjusted the cuff of his jacket. Another drummed his fingers against the table, but quickly stopped when the sound echoed too loudly. They tried to look relaxed, tried to hold their swagger, but their eyes betrayed them. They darted toward the veterans' patches, reading the faded embroidery that bore unit names and insignia. They understood what those symbols meant. Even if they mocked authority, even if they lived to disrupt order, those patches reminded them of men who had walked through something far more severe than bar fights and broken glass. The tall biker who had leaned over Ethan moments earlier cleared his throat. His jaw flexed, his grin forced back onto his face, but it no longer carried conviction. He looked at the leader of the veterans, a broad man with silver hair beneath a worn cap, and found himself staring into eyes that did not flinch. Those eyes weren't loud. They weren't theatrical. They simply held him, steady and unyielding, until his smirk flickered again. No one in the diner spoke. The farmers in the corner sat upright, no longer hiding in their cups. The salesman turned slightly on his stool, watching openly now, his earlier tremble replaced with something closer to awe. Marlene stood straighter behind the counter, her hand resting on the edge as though grounding herself in the wood. Even Ethan, still sitting in his booth, felt the change. His fear had not vanished, but it had been joined by something steadier, a calmness that seeped into him as the silence grew. The bikers shifted again, uncomfortable with the stillness pressing down on them. They were men who thrived on noise, on filling spaces until no one else could breathe. But the veterans had taken control with nothing more than silence. It wasn't passive. It wasn't weakness. It was a kind of silence that spoke louder than shouting, reminding everyone in the room that noise is fleeting but presence endures. One of the younger bikers muttered something under his breath, but the sound died quickly when a veteran's eyes fixed on him. The man didn't move, didn't raise his voice, only looked. The muttering stopped. Another shifted his boot off the cushion where it had been propped. Suddenly aware of how childish the gesture seemed beneath those steady gazes, the tall leader straightened, trying to recover ground. "Evening," he said, his voice carefully casual, but it cracked faintly at the edges. The veterans gave no reply. They didn't need to. Their silence was its own answer, their eyes their own words. The old veteran in the corner finally moved, standing slowly, his joints stiff but his posture tall. He adjusted his cap, then turned toward the group that had entered. Their eyes met his, and for the first time that night, his silence softened into something else, a recognition, a joining of ranks. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The nod he gave them was enough. And in that gesture, the room seemed to settle into order. The bikers could feel it, the shift, the loss of control. Their bravado had drained under the weight of silence, leaving them exposed. They had walked in with engines and noise, certain they could bend the room to their will. But now, with every passing second, the steady gazes of men who carried their past stitched onto their vests stripped them of that illusion. For the first time since the night began, the diner belonged not to the loudest voices, but to the quietest ones. The old man in the corner rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his hand pressing against the edge of the booth for balance. For most of the evening, he had sat there quietly, the weight of his years heavy on his shoulders, the world mistaking his silence for resignation. But now, as the men in leather vests filled the diner with their calm presence, something shifted in him. His spine straightened. His eyes, dulled earlier with weariness, sharpened with sudden clarity. He looked at the newcomers and saw not strangers, but reminders of a life that had once defined him. The patches across their vests told stories no one else in the diner needed explained. Unit numbers, service branches, mottos stitched in thread that had weathered time. He knew them as well as he knew the lines of his own hands. The Marine Corps emblem on one man's chest, the eagle of the 101st Airborne on another, a simple American flag sewn above the heart of a third. These weren't decorations. They were marks of a bond earned in mud, in fire, in places most people prefer to forget. And though decades had passed, though gray now streaked their hair and age lined their faces, the bond was as unbroken as the day it had been forged. His eyes lingered on the man who had led them inside, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, his vest patched with the word Army in faded thread. For a moment the noise of the diner fell away, replaced by memory. He could see the faces of younger men, hear the radio static of orders crackling in the dark, feel the weight of rifle in hands that no longer shook. The years collapsed into that single recognition. These were his brothers, men who had lived what he had lived, who carried the same scars tucked beneath their silence. The leader's gaze found him, and in that exchange something unspoken passed between them. No words, no salute, only the smallest nod. It was enough. The nod was not casual acknowledgement. It was recognition, respect, a greeting between men who knew what it meant to have one stood shoulder to shoulder against chaos. For the first time that night, the old man did not feel alone. His brothers had arrived. The rowdy bikers watched the exchange uneasily. They did not understand the language of the glance, the depth of the nod, but they felt its weight. It was a kind of recognition they could never claim, a bond they could never counterfeit, no matter how loud their engines roared or how many patches they stitched onto their jackets. The silence that followed was heavier than any fist slammed against the counter, and for the first time the bikers looked unsettled, their bravado thinning like smoke. Ethan saw it too. From his booth, he watched the old man's shoulders lift, watched his chin rise with dignity that had been knocked to the floor along with his cap. He understood, even if dimly, that something powerful had just passed between men older than he could imagine. It gave him strength as well, to know his voice had carried until the reinforcements came, to know the silence now belonged to them and not the bullies who had filled it with noise. Marlene behind the counter pressed her towel flat against the wood, her eyes softening as she watched. She had seen the old man come into the diner for years, always alone, always quiet. Tonight, for the first time, he stood not as a solitary figure, but as part of something larger. The nod had made it plain. He was not forgotten, not abandoned. His brothers had come, and with them came the reminder that silence, when shared, could be stronger than the loudest shout. The old man adjusted the brim of his cap, his hand steady now. He didn't smile, but the set of his face carried something close to peace. He did not need to speak. The recognition between men was enough. Ethan felt the shift in the room ripple through him like a current. The veterans stood near the entrance, their silence commanding more than the bikers' noise ever had. The old man in the corner had risen. His nod exchanged with the newcomers, and the weight of that recognition still lingered in the air. The rowdy bikers, once so loud and sure of themselves, sat restless now, their hands fidgeting on glasses, their boots scuffing against the linoleum. Something had cracked open, and everyone could feel it. For Ethan, the tension was no longer just pressing down on him. It was pulling him forward. He slid out of the booth slowly, his sketchbook still clutched in one hand. His legs trembled, but they carried him to his feet anyway. Every eye in the diner seemed to follow his movement, though no one said a word. The tall biker who had leaned over him earlier straightened in surprise, his lips curling into a sneer as if daring him to move further. But Ethan did not stop. He took a step toward the veterans, his shoes clicking softly against the floor. He did not walk quickly, nor with bravado. His pace was steady, deliberate, the kind of walk a boy makes when he knows he is afraid but refuses to let fear dictate his steps. Each stride seemed to echo louder than it should have in the stillness of the diner. He reached the space between his booth and the counter, then paused, standing tall though his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. The veterans watched it with eyes that carried both surprise and approval. One of them, a man with gray beard and a patch that read Airborne, gave the faintest nod, as though acknowledging a choice made in silence. The old man in the corner turned his head as well, his gaze meeting Ethan's with something close to pride. The boy might have been half their age, might have carried no stripes on his shoulders, but in that moment he had chosen to stand among them. The tall biker barked out a laugh, though it was strained. "Look at this," he said to his companions. "Kid thinks he's one of them now." His words echoed, but they lacked the force they once carried. His friends muttered in response, some laughing weakly, others shifting in their seats as if unsure whether to join him. Their noise could not fill the space the way it had before. Ethan didn't answer the man. He didn't need to. His silence was its own reply. He squared his shoulders and lifted his chin, his stance aligning him not with the jeering men who had mocked him, but with the veterans whose quiet presence anchored the room. He wasn't taller, wasn't stronger, but in that line of bodies, he found a place. And though he had stepped away from his booth, he had not stepped back. Marlene watched from behind the counter, her breath caught in her throat. The boy she had seen for years, the one who scribbled in sketchbooks while sipping a single glass of milk, now stood in the middle of the storm with a steadiness that made her chest ache. The farmers in the corner leaned forward, their eyes wide, as though they too could not quite believe what they were seeing. Even the salesman at the counter set his cup down gently, his earlier tremor gone. The bikers shifted again, their bravado crumbling further under the weight of what they witnessed. A boy had joined the line against them, and by doing so, had revealed just how hollow their noise had become. Their engines, their fists, their laughter, all of it felt smaller in the presence of silence shared between men and a boy who refused to retreat. Ethan stood beside the veterans now, his place clear. He was not their equal in years nor in the battles they had fought, but he carried something in his chest that matched theirs, the refusal to bow. It wasn't about size or strength. It was about choosing where to stand, and Ethan had made his choice. The diner had settled into a silence, so dense it seemed to muffle even the hum of the refrigerators in the back. The rowdy bikers, who had entered on a wave of noise and bravado, now sat restless, their laughter hollow, their confidence faltering under the weight of eyes that didn't blink. The veterans, gathered just inside the doorway, didn't posture or raise their voices. They simply stood, their vests marked with service insignia, their presence alone enough to remind the room of a different kind of authority. Ethan stood beside them, smaller in stature but holding himself upright, the steadiness of his silence matching theirs. It was the leader of the group who spoke first, his voice low but clear, cutting through the heavy air like a steady drumbeat. "That's enough," he said, not loud, not threatening, just final. The sound carried the weight of command, without needing volume. Every head turned toward him. The bikers shifted in their seats, some leaning back, others glancing toward the door as if gauging the distance. No one answered immediately. He took a slow step forward, his boots firm against the floor. "You had your fun," he continued, "but it ends here." His words weren't delivered like a challenge. They were statement of fact, unshakable, like orders given on a field where no disobedience could be tolerated. Another veteran, taller and broad across the shoulders, crossed his arms and spoke next. His tone was calm, but it left no room for argument. "This is a place where people come to eat in peace. You don't shove old men here. You don't make a waitress tremble. Not in this town." His gaze swept the room, landing on each biker in turn until they dropped their eyes. The bikers tried to answer with scoffs, but the sound cracked. One muttered something about minding their own business, but even that carried no force. The veterans didn't respond with insults, didn't raise their tone to match. They simply waited, letting the silence press harder against the men who thrived on chaos. The old man who had sat alone earlier now straightened fully, his cap square on his head. His voice, when he spoke, was rough from disuse but steady. "These men know what respect means," he said, nodding toward the group, "and they won't leave until it's given back." His words settled heavily, not as threat, but as promise. The bikers shifted again, their bravado dissolving into fidgets and glances. The tall leader tried once more, his smirk brittle. "What if we don't feel like leaving?" he asked, but even he couldn't disguise the hesitation in his tone. The veteran leader didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the man's. "Then you'll find out what happens when loud boys meet men who've already seen worse than you can dream of." He didn't raise his hand, didn't move an inch beyond that step, but his calm was sharper than any shove. The tall biker looked away first, his jaw tight, his fist unclenched against the counter. Ethan felt the air shift again, this time like a tide retreating. The noise that had dominated the diner all evening was gone, replaced by something stronger than shouting. The authority of men who carried experience instead of arrogance. Their words weren't threats. They were truths, spoken with the kind of weight the bikers could not mimic. Marlene exhaled behind the counter, her shoulders easing. The farmers exchanged glances, their faces softening in relief. Even the salesman allowed himself to look openly at the scene, no longer hiding behind his cup. The diner, for the first time that evening, belonged once more to its people. The veterans said no more than what was needed. They didn't have to. Their calm presence had done what fists and shouts never could. It reminded everyone, even the bikers themselves, of the difference between noise and strength. The veterans had spoken, and the air they left behind was unshakable. It was not the kind of silence that begged for noise to fill it, but the kind that pressed down until every restless movement felt like a trespass. The bikers, who had spent the night pounding fists on tables and mocking anyone who dared look their way, now sat stiff in their seats, their laughter shriveled into smirks that no longer fooled anyone. The weight of steady eyes had done what shouts and threats could not. The bravado had cracked, and nothing could patch it back together. The tall leader stood at the counter still, his jaw tight, his grin forced, but the swagger was gone from his shoulders. His companions shifted in their booths, glancing at one another with unease they couldn't quite disguise. One cleared his throat, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a joke, but no one joined him. Another leaned down, scooping up his jacket from the seat beside him, tugging it on with more haste than he meant to show. The clink of his zipper echoed louder than it should have in the stillness. "Guess we've had our fill," one said finally, his tone flat, not matching the words. He stood and stretched, making a show of it, but his eyes never left the veterans who stood in quiet formation near the door. His boots scuffed against the linoleum as he walked toward the exit, his steps quick, his head low. The bell above the door gave its familiar chime as he slipped outside, the sound carrying through the diner like a release of pressure. Another followed, muttering to no one in particular. "Long ride tomorrow anyway." He shoved his hands into his pockets and pushed past the chair with more force than necessary, as though noise might restore some dignity to his retreat. It didn't. The chair scraped across the floor, but the room remained unmoved. He left without looking back, the door closing behind him with a dull thud. The others began to gather themselves as well, each man fumbling for an excuse. One patted his chest, as if remembering a promise to be somewhere else. Another checked his watch, shaking his head, muttering about time as though the hour mattered now. Each excuse rang hollow, transparent to everyone watching. But no one called him on it. The veterans didn't need to. Their silence alone was enough to usher the men toward the exit one by one. The tall leader lingered longer than the rest, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. He looked at Ethan, still standing near the veterans, his jaw tightening as if considering one last attempt to reclaim control. But the boy did not look away. Ethan's silence, steady now, held him just as firmly as the veteran's presence did. The man's lips curled into a smirk, but it faltered almost immediately. Without another word, he turned sharply, grabbing his jacket from the counter and slinging it over his shoulder. His boots struck hard against the floor as he walked out, his pace brisk, his silence louder than any jeer he might have left behind. The bell chimed again, then again, each departure peeling away the tension layer by layer. When the last of them slipped outside, the roar of engines returned briefly, sputtering to life as the men mounted their bikes. But the sound lacked the same confidence it had carried when they arrived. The engines revved, loud but empty, before fading into the distance down Ridgefield's main street. Inside, the diner remained still, For a moment, no one moved, as though afraid that sound might draw the men back. Then, slowly, breaths returned. Shoulders eased. The spell of fear that had gripped the room began to lift. The regulars exchanged glances, tentative at first, then firmer, as if reassuring themselves it was truly over. Ethan exhaled deeply, his body trembling now that the storm had passed. He had not stepped back, not once, and the biker's retreat had proved what he had felt in his chest all along, that noise and cruelty were never as strong as silence carried with conviction. The roar of engines faded into the night, swallowed by the hills beyond Ridgefield, until the only sounds left in the diner were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint rattle of dishes settling after all the noise. The air still carried the sharpness of what had happened, but the tension that had gripped every corner was loosening, dissolving into something else. Relief came slowly, like breath returning after being held too long. People shifted in their seats, eyes darting toward the door to make sure the rowdy men were truly gone. The farmers leaned back in their booth, rubbing their faces with rough hands. The salesman at the counter finally picked up his cup and took a sip, the tremor gone from his fingers. Ethan stood where he had been all along, beside the veterans, his sketchbook still clutched tightly in one hand. The adrenaline that had held him steady began to ebb, leaving his knees weak, his chest rising and falling with quick breaths he struggled to slow. He wasn't sure what to do now, whether to sit back down, whether to speak, whether to slip away quietly as if none of it had happened. He felt the eyes of the room on him, but not with the sharpness of ridicule. They were softer now, filled with something closer to wonder, as though the boy who had always blended into the corners of Ridgefield had revealed a side of himself no one had expected. The old man in the corner moved then, pushing himself fully to his feet. His movements were stiff, deliberate, but steady. He adjusted the brim of his cap, tugging it down with a kind of dignity that had been restored. His eyes met Ethan's, and for a long moment he simply looked at the boy, studying him the way a man studies something rare, something important. Then he stepped closer, his boots scuffing softly against the worn floor. When he reached Ethan's side, he didn't speak. Words weren't needed. Instead, he lifted one hand, lined with age, knuckles rough from years of labor, veins raised beneath skin weathered by time, and set it gently on Ethan's shoulder. The weight was light, but the meaning behind it pressed deeper than anything said that night. His grip lingered only for a breath, steady and firm, before releasing, but in that touch was a commendation more powerful than applause. Ethan's throat tightened. He looked up at the old man and saw gratitude in his eyes, but more than that, recognition. The boy had spoken when silence had nearly broken the room, and the veteran acknowledged it with gesture that spoke of brotherhood, as though for a moment Ethan had stood among men who knew what it meant to hold a line. He swallowed hard, unsure if he should respond, but the old man's faint nod was enough to still his thoughts. The other veterans watched quietly, their faces unreadable, but their presence heavy with approval. They said nothing, letting the gesture stand on its own. Marlene, behind the counter, pressed a hand to her chest, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to speak, but thought better of it. The farmer sat straighter in their booth, nodding faintly, and the salesman gave a small exhale, shaking his head as if to say he had just witnessed something he never thought possible. The boy remained rooted in place, his shoulder still carrying the memory of that hand. The touch had lasted only seconds, but it felt carved into him, something he knew he would never forget. It wasn't praise in the way others might have given it. It was deeper, quieter, the kind of respect a man gives another when he knows the cost of standing firm. The old man withdrew his hand, adjusted his cap again, and turned slightly toward the veterans who had come. They gave him the same small nod they had given each other when they entered, a wordless acknowledgement of something completed. For Ethan, watching them, it felt like a circle had closed, one he hadn't even known he had stepped into until tonight. The diner remained hushed, the ordinary rhythm still waiting to return, but the silence carried no fear now. It carried recognition. It carried respect. And for Ethan, the hand on his shoulder had spoken louder than any voice could have. For a long moment after the old man's hand left Ethan's shoulder, the diner stayed wrapped in silence, as if the very walls needed time to remember how to hold ordinary sound again. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, the coffee machine hissed in the background, and somewhere in the kitchen a pan clattered as it settled back into place. These small noises, so common they usually went unnoticed, returned like old friends, timid at first, but steady enough to remind everyone that the storm had passed. The farmers were the first to move. One leaned back in his booth, dragging a hand down his weathered face before letting out a long, tired sigh. The other cleared his throat, not to speak but to break the tension in his chest, and reached for his coffee as though it might finally taste the way it should. The salesman at the counter adjusted his glasses, lifted his cup, and took a slow sip, closing his eyes briefly as if savoring the ordinary act of drinking without trembling. Their movements were small, almost fragile, but they spread through the room like ripples, signaling that it was safe again to breathe. Marlene pressed her palms flat against the counter, her towel still clenched in one hand. She exhaled deeply, the tension that sat high in her chest finally slipping out. The lines around her mouth softened, her shoulders dropping from the rigid stance she had held all evening. She picked up a fresh coffee pot, poured herself a cup, and took a slow drink before moving to refill the cups of the farmers without being asked. Her steps were steady again, no longer rushed or trembling. The routine of her work returned like a bomb, a way of stitching the room back together. The veterans did not move quickly. They remained near the door, their posture firm but relaxed now, their eyes still scanning the room with the calm of men who had learned never to assume a moment was truly over until it proved itself. One adjusted his vest. Another placed a hand lightly on the old man's shoulder, the gesture brief but filled with meaning. They spoke only in low murmurs, not meant for anyone else, their presence alone enough to hold the peace they had helped restore. Ethan stood rooted in place, his body still humming with the remnants of fear and defiance. He hadn't realized he had been holding his breath until he let it go, a shaky exhale that released him the weight in his chest. His legs trembled, though he tried to keep them steady, and his hand tightened around his sketchbook until the edges pressed hard into his palm. He felt the shift in the room around him, the slow return of normalcy, and it was almost dizzying. The diner was breathing again, and with it came the realization that he had been part of the reason it could. The sound of forks against plates returned next, tentative at first, then steadier. Someone chuckled softly, not at a joke, but from the simple relief of hearing his own voice without fear. The bell above the door jangled faintly when a late customer peeked in, then quickly left. But even that sound felt ordinary again, just part of Ridgefield's rhythm. Relief did not come with cheers or applause. It came quietly, in the way people straightened their backs, in the way eyes softened when they glanced at one another, in the way the room itself seemed to expand again now that it wasn't being crushed by noise. The storm had passed, leaving no wreckage except the memory of how fragile peace could be, and how strong could become when held together by even the smallest acts of courage. Ethan looked toward the counter and saw Marlene watching him for a moment before turning back to her work. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried something he hadn't seen before, a recognition, a respect that spoke more than words could. He lowered his gaze, his face warm, and gripped his sketchbook tighter. The diner, Ridgefield's steady heart, had survived the night. Its walls still stood, its lights still buzzed, its coffee still poured. But for those inside, something had changed. They had seen fear press hard against them, and they had seen it lifted, not by fists or noise, but by quiet resolve, by men who carried their past stitched on their vests, and by a boy who refused to step back. And now, as the breaths came easier and the room slowly filled again with the rhythm of ordinary life, everyone felt it. The diner was breathing, and so were they. Ethan lowered himself back into the booth, his body still taut from the weight of the night. The veterans remained near the doorway, silent but steady, and the old man had returned to his seat with dignity restored. Around the diner, the hum of ordinary life had begun to return, forks against plates, the scrape of chairs, the sighs of men who were grateful simply to be left in peace. Yet for Ethan, the room was not the same as it had been before. It felt larger somehow, charged with the echoes of everything that had just happened. He sat still, his chest rising and falling, until his eyes fell to the sketchbook he had carried through it all. The cover was smudged, the edges bent, its pages filled with pieces of Ridgefield's quiet rhythms. He opened it slowly, as though even emotion required a kind of courage, and stared down at the clean sheet that had remained blank through the storm. His hand trembled as he lifted the pencil, the tip hovering above the page. For a moment, he wondered if he could do it, if the act of trying to capture what had just unfolded might break the fragile calm inside him. But the pencil lowered, and the line began to take shape. He started with the counter, the plate still rattling in his memory from the force of a fist. Then the tall figure of the biker, hunched now in retreat, but burned into his mind in that moment of looming threat. The lines came jagged at first, uneven with a tremor in his hand, but as he kept drawing, they steadied. He shaded in the leather vests, the heavy rings, the boots planted on linoleum. His chest tightened as he put them on the page, as if he were exorcising their presence from the room by trapping them in graphite. But he did not stop with them. His pencil moved again, softer now, drawing the outline of the old man's cap, the brim bent where it had struck the floor. He gave careful detail to the letters stitched across it, his strokes patient, reverent. He sketched the man's face too, lined and weary but strong in its silence, his eyes fixed forward as though waiting for brothers he knew would come. Finally, Ethan's pencil traced the veterans at the door, their vests marked with patches, their shoulders squared, their eyes calm and unflinching. He could not capture the sound of their silence, the authority it carried, but he tried. He drew the way they stood, not in threat, but in presence, and the way the light from the diner's lamps caught the faded fabric of their insignia. He even drew himself, though it felt strange. A boy at a booth, smaller than the others, his shoulders squared only by determination, a sketchbook clutched in hand. His lines grew surer with each stroke, the trembling in his fingers fading as his focus sharpened. The page filled quickly, the images not perfect but alive, each one carrying the weight of what he had just seen and felt. For the first time that night, his breath evened, the act of drawing pulling him back into himself. When he looked up, Marlene was watching him from behind the counter. She said nothing, but her eyes softened, and she gave the faintest nod before turning back to pour another cup of coffee. The old man in the corner had seen as well, his gaze lingering on the boy's moving hand. He did not interrupt, but the flicker of pride in his expression was unmistakable. Ethan bent back over the page, finishing the sketch with careful strokes. He had not spoken much that night, only a few words, steady but shaking. Yet in this drawing, in the lines he carved on the paper, he captured everything: fear, defiance, silence, strength. When he closed the book at last, his hand rested on the cover with a quiet finality. The moment was his now, preserved in graphite, a memory he could return to when the noise of the world tried again to drown him. The veterans did not leave right away. Once the rowdy men had gone and the room began to settle, they moved slowly toward the counter, their boots steady against the worn linoleum. Marlene, her hands no longer trembling, poured coffee into heavy mugs and set them before the men without a word. It was a kind of service that needed no asking. She seemed to know instinctively that they would stay a while. The air in the diner had shifted, still carrying the weight of what had happened, but softened now by the comfort of routine. They drank quietly at first, the steam rising from their cups, their shoulders relaxing into the rhythm of the place. Their presence filled the diner, not in the way the biker's noise had, but with a calm that steadied everyone else. The farmers lingered in their booth, half listening, and the salesman nursed what was left of his coffee, unwilling to leave just yet. Even Ethan stayed rooted in his seat, his sketchbook still warm from the drawing he had made. He could hear their voices now, low and even, each word carrying the cadence of memory. One of the men, his vest stitched with a faded eagle, spoke first. "Funny thing," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Noise is always loudest when it's empty. You spend enough time in the field, you learn that quick." He set his cup down carefully, as though the porcelain deserved respect. The others nodded, the words simple but true. Another leaned back slightly, his hand wrapped around the mug, his eyes distant. It's not about who can shout the loudest. It's about who stands when it matters. His tone was soft, not meant as a lecture, just a fact spoken aloud. Ethan felt the words settle into him, as if they had been meant for his ears alone. The old man in the corner, who had endured their jeers in silence, finally spoke more than a few words. "When I saw you walk in," he said, his voice gravelly, "I remembered what it felt like, that sound of engines. Men who came not for trouble, but because they wouldn't let you face it alone. His eyes moved Ethan briefly, then back to his brothers. Didn't think I'd see it again, but here we are. The leader of the group, the one whose silver hair caught the light, gave a small smile that barely reached his eyes. That's the thing about Brotherhood, he said. It doesn't retire. Doesn't end when you hang up the uniform. It follows you. It waits until it's needed again. He looked around the diner, meeting the gaze of each of the regulars before settling on Ethan. Sometimes it waits in the quietest places. The words were not heavy, not dramatic, but they filled the room with a warmth that had been missing. The bikers had left behind fear and broken silence, but the veterans left behind something different. The reminder that courage could be shared, that standing firm was not always loud or violent, but often quiet, steady, and unyielding. Ethan listened without speaking, absorbing every syllable. He felt small among them, but not in the way he once had. He felt part of something larger, something that stretched beyond Ridgefield, beyond the walls of the diner. He thought of his father, of the silence he had left behind, and wondered if perhaps this was what he had meant in those quiet lessons Ethan carried still. Marlene refilled their cups without asking, her steps lighter now, her eyes softer. The veterans spoke in turns, each story short, not about battles won, but about men remembered, about moments when silence and courage had carried them through. They did not glorify, did not boast. They spoke simply, as men who knew that true strength did not need embellishment. The diner breathed with them, each word sinking into the walls, into the ears of those who stayed. For the first time in hours, perhaps in years, Ridgefield's little diner felt not just like a place to eat, but like a place where something larger had been preserved. And Ethan, sitting with his sketchbook pressed against his chest, knew he would never forget it. Ethan stayed in his booth, his sketchbook resting against his chest, while the veterans' voices drifted across the diner. They didn't speak loudly, and their words weren't polished, but every sentence carried a weight that seemed to settle deeper than anything the bikers had thrown into the room earlier. Their talk wasn't about proving strength. It was about remembering moments where standing firm had mattered, where silence had carried more than noise ever could. Ethan listened with focus sharper than any he had brought to his drawings. His ears tuned to every syllable as if afraid to miss something that might slip past. One of the veterans, his vest patched with faded emblem, spoke of nights overseas when the world was chaos outside, and all that kept men steady was a quiet inside their lines. Sometimes you didn't shout, didn't fire, he said. You just waited, breathing with the man next to you, knowing he was breathing with you. That was enough. His words were slow, deliberate, and they carried the kind of truth that didn't need to be explained. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers tightening around the edge of his sketchbook, struck by the thought that silence could be strength, not weakness. Another, older than the rest, with hands scarred and thick from years of labor after service, added his own story. When you stand in front of fear, it doesn't go away. It doesn't ever leave you. But you learn not to let it make the choices. That's all resolve is, doing what you must, even when your knees are shaking. His eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan, not in challenge but in recognition. The boy felt the words settle into him, filling a place he hadn't known was empty. The old man who had sat in the corner all night lifted his coffee and took a sip before speaking. You learn, he said, his voice low, that courage isn't always a roar. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's the choice to speak when no one else will. His gaze lingered on Ethan, steady and sure, and the boy's breath caught. He realized they weren't just talking to one another. They were including him, pulling him quietly into a circle he had never imagined himself part of. Ethan's mind replayed the moment when his own voice had broken the silence earlier, trembling but firm, his words pushing back against the laughter of grown men. He remembered how terrified he had been, how his chest had burned, his hands had nearly slipped from the table. And yet, hearing these men now, he began to understand what he had done differently from the bikers. He hadn't tried to be louder. He hadn't tried to match their noise. He had spoken because it was right, and because silence had become too heavy to bear. It was the same kind of silence these veterans now spoke of, the kind that gave strength instead of taking it. The boy listened as their stories wove together, each one short, each one carrying the same thread. Strength was not in fists, not in noise, but in the decision to remain upright when the world leaned hard against you. Ethan sat smaller than the men, his frame still thin, his face still young, but in their words he felt himself growing. He wasn't one of them, not yet, but he had learned something of what they carried. The veterans did not lecture him, did not call him out by name. They simply spoke, their voices low, their stories weaving into the fabric of the night. But Ethan knew that by listening he was being given something rare, something that would stay with him long after the coffee mugs were emptied and the chairs pushed back. He sat quietly, absorbing it all, learning what silence and resolve truly meant. The bell above the diner door rang again, its gentle chime startling after so much stillness. For a moment, everyone turned, instinctively bracing as though the rowdy men might have returned. But the figure that stepped through the doorway was not clad in leather or carrying noise. It was a woman, her face tight with worry, her steps quick, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for something she feared she might not find. Ethan's mother had arrived. Her coat was half-buttoned, her hair pinned back hastily, and she still wore the apron from her shift. She must have come straight from work, drawn by the phone call that trouble had found its way into Miller's diner. The sight of the veterans near the counter and the townsfolk still gathered at their tables only heightened her alarm. Her gaze swept the room with urgency until it found Ethan. He was standing near the booth where he had sat earlier, his sketchbook clutched close to his chest. His shoulders were squared in a way she had never quite seen before, his chin lifted not with arrogance, but with a steadiness that surprised her. For a heartbeat, relief flooded her face at the sight of him unharmed, but it quickly shifted into confusion. The tension in the room was still thick enough to taste, yet her boy stood at the center of it, surrounded by men far older, men whose presence radiated the calm of something already resolved. She hurried to him, her hands reaching instinctively to his arms as though to reassure herself that he was real, that he was safe. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you all right?" Her eyes searched his face, looking for signs of injury, of fear. But instead of the shaken child she expected, she found a boy who met her gaze without flinching, his eyes steady though still bright, with a residue of adrenaline. The veterans watched silently, their cups of coffee untouched for the moment. The old man in the corner, his cap square on his head again, gave a small nod in Ethan's direction, as if silently offering the mother an explanation without words. Marlene, from behind the counter, caught the woman's eye and softened her expression, a quiet reassurance that though the night had been dangerous, her son had come through it with something more than survival. Ethan swallowed and answered softly, "I'm okay, Mom." His voice was calm, steadier than she had ever heard it in moments of strain. He didn't need to explain yet. The room already carried the story. The way the bikers had been gone long before she entered, the way the veterans remained like sentinels, the way every pair of eyes in the diner carried a kind of quiet pride when they turned toward him. These told her more than his words could. Her fear softened into something else as she looked around and saw the way others regarded him. The farmers, usually too reserved to show much feeling, gave faint nods in his direction. The salesman, still clutching his cup, met her eyes and then shifted his gaze to Ethan, as if to say, "You should be proud." Marlene's lips curved into the smallest smile, one that carried both relief and respect. The mother's hand remained on her son's arm, but her grip eased. She studied him closely, seeing not just her boy, but someone who had stepped into a role she had never imagined he would face. The sketchbook still pressed to his chest seemed almost symbolic now, proof that even with nothing but his words, his resolve, he had found a way to stand. The veterans gave no speeches, offered no explanations. They simply watched, their silence filled with approval that needed no elaboration. The old man's eyes softened as he looked from the boy to his mother, and in his faint smile was the acknowledgement that she, too, had raised something worth respect. For the first time that night, Ethan's mother breathed deeply, her fear giving way to a quiet pride. She had come expecting to gather her son from danger, to scold him for stepping into something far bigger than himself. Instead, she found herself standing in a room where her boy had already stood tall, where others far older had marked his courage with their silence. She pulled him close, her arm wrapping around his shoulders, but she did not shield him the way she once would have. She simply held him, aware that the boy she thought she knew had shown her, and everyone else, that he was capable of more than anyone had realized. The veterans lingered near the counter, their mugs half empty, their conversation quieter now, their presence still anchoring the room. The danger had passed, yet they remained, as though to ensure the peace held. Ethan stood close to his mother, her arm draped gently over his shoulders. She had calmed, though her eyes still moved across the room as if cataloging every detail. She saw the quiet nods of respect on the townsfolk, the settled expression on the old man's face, and the boy who stood taller than when she had first rushed through the door. It was then that one of the veterans stepped forward. He was a stocky man, his beard trimmed close, his vest patched with service insignia that bore the faded colors of a unit long past its prime, but never forgotten. He studied Ethan for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as though weighing the worth of a decision. His hand lifted slowly to his chest, fingers brushing across one of the patches sewn just above his heart. The fabric was worn, its edges frayed, the stitching dull with years, but it was unmistakable, a small insignia, simple in design but heavy with meaning. The man tugged at the corner, pulling the patch free with a careful motion, his fingers lingering on it for a second longer before he stepped closer to Ethan. The diner grew still again, every eye turning to watch. Ethan blinked in surprise as the veteran stopped in front of him, towering but not intimidating, his expression unreadable. The man held the patch in his rough hand, then extended it toward the boy. "This," he said quietly, his voice gravelly but steady, "belonged to my unit. We carried it on our vests, not because of the cloth, but because of what it stood for. Resolve, brotherhood, standing when it mattered." He looked down at Ethan, his gaze sharp but softened at the edges. "Tonight, you did that." Ethan's breath caught. He glanced at his mother, whose eyes widened in shock and then softened with a mix of pride and disbelief. He looked back at the veteran, his hands trembling slightly as the man pressed the patch into his palm. The fabric was warm from the man's chest, the threads rough against his skin. It felt heavier than it should have, as though the years of memory it carried had passed into his hand along with the cloth. "You held your ground," the veteran continued. "That's not something men twice your age can always do. Don't forget it." His words were simple, but they sank deep, each syllable carved into moment. The old man in the corner gave another slow nod, his expression one of agreement, as though the gift had his blessing as well. The other veterans, still by the counter, did not speak, but their eyes rested on Ethan with the same silent respect. The gesture was not casual. It was a passing of something sacred, the kind of thing done rarely and only when earned. Ethan stared at the patch in his hand, his chest tight. He felt the rough threads dig into his skin as he closed his fingers around it. He wanted to speak, to thank them, but his throat ached too much for words. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes meeting the veterans, his silence carrying all the weight of gratitude he couldn't say aloud. His mother's hand pressed lightly against his back, steadying him. She looked at the patch in his hand, then at the men who had given it, and her expression softened into tears she did not let fall. She understood what had just been entrusted to her son. The diner seemed to hold the moment gently, as if even its walls knew it mattered. No one clapped, no one cheered. The gift was not for display. It was between men who had carried weight before, and a boy who had chosen not to bow when it would have been easier. Ethan tucked the patch carefully into his sketchbook, pressing it between the pages as though to guard it. He knew it was not just a keepsake. It was a reminder, a responsibility, and perhaps the beginning of a story that would follow him long after the night had faded. The night outside was cooler than Ethan expected, the kind of sharp Vermont air that seemed to cleanse the lungs after hours spent in a place thick with tension. The street was quiet now, the roar of engines long gone, replaced only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a truck on the highway. The sky above was fading into deep indigo, the last traces of dusk stretching like pale brushstrokes along the horizon. Ethan stepped out of the diner beside his mother, his sketchbook tucked under one arm, his other hand clenched tightly around the patch the veteran had given him. For a moment he paused on the sidewalk, looking back through the glass windows. Inside, the veterans lingered a little longer, their silhouettes steady at the counter. Marlene moved between tables again, pouring coffee, wiping surfaces, her routine restored, but her shoulders held straighter than before. The farmers had leaned together, speaking in quiet tones, and the salesman sat with a new calm, sipping his coffee without shaking. The old man in the corner, his cap firmly in place, caught Ethan's eye once more. He gave a final nod, slow and deliberate, before turning back to his brothers. Ethan nodded in return, the patch pressed tight against his palm as if in salute. His mother touched his arm lightly, guiding him forward. They began to walk home along Ridgefield's narrow street, their footsteps crunching against gravel and pavement. She didn't speak at first. Her eyes studied him from the corner of her gaze, searching his face the way only a mother could. She had come rushing into the diner with fear clawing at her chest, expecting to find her boy small and cornered. Instead, she had seen him standing upright among men who carried themselves like stone, her son's name unspoken, but his place undeniable. Ethan didn't break the silence either. He walked with a patch clenched in his fist, the rough threads cutting faintly into his skin. Each step made him more aware of its weight. It was such a small thing, just cloth and stitching, yet it carried with it something vast. Stories of men he had never met, battles he had never fought, and a kind of brotherhood he had only glimpsed tonight. He thought of the words a veteran had spoken. That resolve wasn't about being fearless, but about standing anyway. He thought of his own voice, trembling but steady, cutting into the biker's laughter, and realized it had been his own version of that same resolve. The houses of Ridgefield stood quietly as they passed, porches lit by soft yellow lamps, curtains drawn against the night. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. The ordinary calm of the town had returned, but for Ethan, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The night had marked him, carved into his memory like a line too deep to ever fade. He had seen how noise could crumble before silence, how laughter meant nothing when steadied against resolve, and how men carried brotherhood not in their voices, but in the way they stood. His mother finally spoke, her voice low, more tender than he expected. "You scare me tonight." She glanced at him, her eyes glistening faintly in the streetlight. "But you made me proud, too." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Ethan felt the truth of it in her tone, and it made his chest ache with something he couldn't quite name. He opened his sketchbook as they walked, sliding the patch carefully between the pages, pressing it flat so it would not be lost. It would live there alongside his drawings. The counter rattling from a fist, the cap fallen on the floor, the veteran standing steady in the doorway. But the patch was different from pencil lines. It was real, proof that the night had happened, proof that his words had mattered. As they turned onto their street, Ethan looked up at the sky. The stars were clearer now, scattered across the dark like distant embers. He thought of the old man's nod, of the hand that had rested on his shoulder, of the veteran's calm voices over coffee. He thought of the silence that had nearly broken the room, and the silence that had saved it. He held the patch tighter, and in the cool Vermont night, he understood something he would carry forward. That courage didn't always look like strength, and resolve didn't always sound like thunder. Sometimes it was a boy's voice breaking through laughter. Sometimes it was a gnawed share between old men. Sometimes it was a weight of cloth pressed into a hand. It was small, it was quiet, but endured. Ethan walked the last stretch home with that lesson etched into him, knowing it would remain long after the night faded into memory.